You're juggling it all: work, family, decisions, expectations, 6 hats, maybe more every single day. But behind the scenes, your body is running on stress, and stress left unchecked will lead to illness. I'm Dr. Shami, an integrated family doctor, and this is 6 Hats, the podcast that helps you understand what stress is doing to your body and what you can do about it now. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the 6 Hats podcast. And today we're busting one of the biggest nutrition myths of our time, fat. Joining me is Zoe Harcombe, researcher, author, and straight talking advocate for real food. We're unpacking fear around fat, from weight gain to cholesterol to heart disease, and what the science actually says. Now, if you've ever been told to avoid butter, this one's for you. Welcome, Zoe.
Thank you for having me.
Oh my God, I'm so excited. I've been following your work for years. Love your talks. Love how you make it so easy for your listeners to understand complex medical world. And so the whole point of this podcast is to really get the message across about fat. And it all sparked off when one of my patients goes, yeah, I'm trying to lose weight. So we went through what she was eating and she goes, yeah, I only eat egg whites. And I go, why is that? Why you're avoiding yolk? She goes, oh, it's fat. And I don't want to get fat by avoiding fat. And I was just like, oh my God, there's so much re-education here. And this has literally happened a couple of weeks ago, Zoe. So there's so many women out there super scared about fat. And that's who I see in my clinic. And I love to have this conversation around it. So shall we dive into it?
Yeah, let's go.
Amazing. So the first question, I think just what I mentioned, fat makes you fat. That's a really common myth. Let's walk through why that idea is flawed. I'm going to leave it all to you now.
Okie doke. I mean, it's an unfortunate word, isn't it? Fat, because people think dietary fat makes you body fat. I don't know who said this, but I love it. That's no more true than greens make you green. You know, you don't fear your vegetables because you think they're going to make you green. Fat is not going to make you fat, but there is this myth that it will. Right, what's the quickest way to unpack this? I mean, first of all, the calorie theory is complete and utter nonsense. So we can always do that another time, or you could go on my website and put in calorie video and you'd see me talk about that for about 45 minutes. But people think that getting fat is all about calories, and it's not. It's about storing body fat. And people store body fat basically when they've got the right physiological state to store body fat, which is when insulin is present. And what causes insulin to be present? Carbohydrates. So this was a real penny drop moment for me. Imagine a little pie in front of you. There are only 3 things, forget alcohol. There's only 3 things that have got calories, and that's carbohydrate, protein, and fat. Now, a nutritional fact, I can give you the evidence for it, but just trust me for now. Protein tends to be about 15% in any natural diet. Surprisingly, whether you're vegetarian or not, it's about 15%. So the minute you tell people not to eat fat, which is what happened with the dietary guidelines going back to about 1980, you've got to fill up the slack with carbohydrates. So think about it. You've got 15% protein. You tell people to have no more than 30% of their diet in the form of fat. 55% has to be in the form of carbohydrate. And the body simply has no need for any carbohydrate, not to digest carbohydrate, let alone that intake of carbohydrate. So our body, if you think about your basic metabolic needs, our body basically really does want fat and protein because that's what repairs us, that's what builds bone density, that's what fights infection, fat particularly is ubiquitous. It's the thing that can do the most things in the human body. Carbohydrates are basically for energy, and fat would replace carbohydrate for that energy. So you don't actually need carbohydrate. But what we're doing with getting our body to eat this much carbohydrate is we are constantly in a fat storing mode. So the body will only lose weight. What is actually losing weight? It's breaking down body fat. The body will only break down body fat when it has to. It is not going to give up body fat easily. We're designed to do the opposite. So it will break down body fat when there is no other fuel available. Now, if you're eating carbohydrates all day long, you have carbohydrate fuel available for energy all day long. You never need to break down body fat. And any that you don't use up that day gets stored as glycogen. It will get stored as glycogen for 24 hours, and then it gets turned to body fat. So you keep eating too much carbohydrate, which is what everyone is doing if they're following the government dietary guidelines, you will just keep yourself in a fat storing mode. Even if you're not eating that many calories, if you're eating most of your calories in the form of carbohydrate, you never let your body get into the physiological state where it actually can break down body fat. So ironically, what you want to be eating more of is fat, and what you want to be eating less of is carbohydrate. Don't worry about the calories in fat. Don't worry about the calories in carbohydrate. It's not about calories. It's about being in the state where you can lose or gain body fat.
Oh my God, that's music to my ears, because literally, the language is, I'm not, eating too many calories or not eating enough calories, but you're spot on. It's actually about insulin, telling your body to store fat. And that's why in the clinic we do fasting insulin. So I often say to patients, you can have a normal fasting glucose, but you can have a high fasting insulin at the same time. And that's driving fat storage. And so I love what you said. It's music to my ears, Zoe. And why do you think people are scared of fat, in the sense of they think it's going to make them fat? Because sometimes there's a fear around it.
Yeah, so it is the calorie thing. So if you're a calorie counter, you know that carbohydrates have got approximately 4 calories per gram, protein's got approximately 4 calories per gram, fat has got approximately 9 calories per gram. So if you're a calorie counter, you are automatically driven away from fat. You fear fat and you eat more carbohydrate instead. So you're going for the less nutritious foods. You're going for the less fulfilling foods. You're going for the foods that you're going to crave, the ones that you're going to feel addicted to. So you're eating crisp breads instead of scrambled eggs, which is not going to keep you full. You're doing all the wrong things. But there is also a bigger fear around fat, and this is the area where I did my PhD. So back in 1977, when the first dietary goals came in anywhere, and it was in the US, and it was the Senator McGovern Committee, and they were supposed to be just looking at poverty and what can we do to get Americans who are impoverished eating better. And then, as is typical with these committees, they're like, oh, we quite like all the glory of getting to decide what Americans can do. Everyone's a control freak at the end of the day. We're going to tell everyone what they can eat, whether they're impoverished or not. So we're going to start coming up with these dietary goals. And then, of course, we have the dietary guidelines for Americans that came out in 1980. They come out every 5 years. So we're looking at the 2025 ones at the moment. The rest of the world follows suit. So we then got dietary guidelines. You got dietary guidelines in New Zealand. Everywhere got these dietary guidelines, all on the back of what the Americans were doing. And the original dietary guidelines, this was my PhD question. Original dietary guidelines were introduced in the name of heart disease. So it was observed that men were starting to die from heart disease. And without sort of going into all of the history, they started to make a connection between, was it cholesterol in the diet? Was it fat in the diet? And various studies were done at around that time. So my PhD question was, okay, these dietary guidelines were introduced and they demonized fat, and they were introduced in the name of heart disease, particularly heart disease deaths, and deaths being part of the all-cause death. So it was all about, sort of mortality and heart disease. Were they right? Was the evidence there to introduce those dietary guidelines? And to cut my 4 years of actual PhD research and all the research I'd done before then, because I was fascinated in things like the 7 countries study, the dietary trials, what they'd done, what difference it had made. To cut the long story short, there is absolutely zero evidence that those dietary guidelines should have been introduced. And I looked at the highest level of evidence. So I pulled all the randomized controlled trials in what's called meta-analysis. I pulled all the epidemiological studies, again in what's called meta-analysis. I looked at it at the time. So the first part of the research question was, okay, if I were on the Dietary Guidelines Committee back in 1980, 83, would I have introduced those guidelines with the evidence that was available? No. And then I looked at the Dietary Guidelines documents, and some of them are 900 pages long. Did they reference those trials? Did they take into account that evidence? No, they didn't. I mean, it really was on a whim. It was a bunch of people who knew very little. It was politicians, people who knew very little about nutrition. One of them had been on a low-fat Pritikin boot camp, and it had done quite well for him. So he's kind of, everybody should go low fat. And of course, now you think about those 3 things. Low fat is high carbohydrate, which is why low carb is high carbohydrate, high carb is low carbohydrate, and so on. High fat is low carbohydrate. So, they sort of interchange those 2 things. If you go low fat, you automatically go in high carb. And we have had an explosion in type 2 diabetes and obesity ever since. And those guidelines were introduced in the name of something that there was literally no evidence for. And there's no more evidence today. I did the up-to-date research at the time of my PhD in 2016 and said, okay, that was back in 1980. Have we got more evidence now? And the answer is still no. There is no evidence that total fat or saturated fat is bad for us. There's no evidence it's going to reduce deaths. There's no evidence it's going to reduce heart deaths. All of this was done in the name of heart disease in men. No women have ever been studied. And there is simply no evidence whatsoever But it's one of those myths that has just prevailed, like 5 a day or 8 glasses of water or alcohol units or whatever, they're all just plucked out of the air and they gather a momentum and then you just can't get rid of them. And that's where we are on fearing fat.
Wow. I loved what you mentioned about dietary guidelines, because I have this challenge here in Australia when patients go and see a dietitian. And it's really interesting because they followed my advice. They start losing weight. They start seeing the HbA1c go down. And I actually had a patient experiment and say, oh, I just went to see a dietitian and we redid the bloods and it actually became worse. And I didn't realize he actually went to see a dietitian in the midst of all of it. And he goes, oh, I was told I don't need to eat as much protein, and as a result, fat, and as a result, he increased his carbs. So when we did it the other way around, he was, on a better trajectory. And it was really just brings it to awareness, because that's what they believe to be true, because that's what they're taught. And I love that you mentioned that there's actually no evidence for it. The dietary guidelines, there is no evidence. And I've got the proof, even in my clinic, how when you do follow it, you get worse, you do become diabetic or insulin resistant. And it's so important for patients to be aware of that.
Yeah, and they're very heavily conflicted. I mean, if you haven't had Belinda Fettke on your podcast, you should. Belinda has done a lot of the work on the background to where does all this advice come from? And of course, a lot of it is traceable back right to the sort of 1700s and the cereal conglomerates. So you've got Sylvester Graham of Graham's Crackers, and that starts coming in. You've got Seventh-day Adventist involvement. You've got a number of the cereal companies, particularly, I think, Sanitarium in Australia, that have still got these Seventh-day Adventist influences. So it's a sort of very puritanical message, and it's sort of fibre will cleanse the soul, and not having fibre is, if you have lots of meat and animal foods, then you're going to be wicked and lustful, and all these crazy beliefs that sort of got embedded into the dietary guidelines. But you look now that sort of that puritanical message seems to have moved away a little bit. People aren't aware of the Seventh-day Adventist influence, but it is still there. But the idea that has sort of prevailed with dietitians is still very much, oh yes, but you need to eat your healthy whole grains and get all your fibre. Most dietetic organisations that I've looked at, go and have a look at their sponsors, their gold partners. They are the cereal conglomerates. You'll usually find Kellogg's in there. And any study where you see breakfast is the most important meal of the day and you must be breaking your fast with cereal, and especially a high brand cereal, high fibre cereal, look at the sponsors, and they tend to be cereal company organisations, or they do it one step removed now. So you'll find, oh, this is sponsored by the Australian Dietetic Association or whatever it's called, and then they in turn are partnered with the cereal companies. So the conflicts might be one step removed, but they're there. We're getting messages from big food. The farmers who are trying to sell us meat and eggs and dairy, they just don't have the funds. The margins are just too tight. It takes a lot of money to produce a quality steak or some quality free-range eggs. There's no markup at the end of the day, so they can't do the little tokens to put in with your eggs to tempt your children into having eggs for breakfast and all that kind of thing. So there's always sort of conflicts in this world, as well as just messages that have no evidence base whatsoever.
I'm so glad you mentioned it. Now, I think you kind of touched on my next question, that whole fat raises cholesterol and then high cholesterol causes heart disease. Can we talk more about that?
Yeah. Where did this even come from? So I guess just quick history, and probably trace this back. So the whole cholesterol idea, this was in the review of the literature in my PhD. So the very first idea that cholesterol is bad in any way can be traced back to some Russian pathologists in the early 1900s. So Anichowskow and some of his colleagues. And these pathologists were noticing, they were able to just cut people open, no ethics, no forms. Somebody dies suddenly, just chop them open and see what's going on. And what they discovered was that there was quite often an area of damage, and then there was fatty deposits around that area of damage, and they would look at the fatty deposits and they would say, oh, one of them is cholesterol. So of course the hypothesis then became that the cholesterol caused the damage, whereas, as we know, but not enough people know and realise today, cholesterol is one of the repair tools in the body, which is why it's transported around the body in lipoproteins, because the body wants it to get to the cells, because it's part of the repair toolkit that travels around the body in lipoproteins. So it's kind of like, a really good analogy is when you go to a fire, you'll find the firefighters there, but they didn't cause the fire. They're there to fix the fire. The cholesterol is there, but it didn't cause the damage. It's there to fix the damage. But anyway, they hypothesized, is cholesterol a problem? So they started feeding cholesterol to rabbits. What they didn't realize then, they weren't nutritionists, they were pathologists. So cholesterol is only found in foods of animal origin. So you only find dietary cholesterol in meat, fish, eggs, and dairy. So vegans never consume dietary cholesterol. Well, rabbits are herbivores, so they're not intended to consume dietary cholesterol. So the rabbits were clogging up, but you were feeding them something that they weren't supposed to be eating. But this sort of idea that dietary cholesterol could clog up arteries started to be embedded in people's minds. Enter Ancel Keys around the 1950s, the guy who did the brilliant Minnesota starvation experiment. And Keys picked up where the pathologists left off, and he said, okay, let's look and see if dietary cholesterol is causing blood cholesterol, and then if in turn blood cholesterol is causing a problem in heart disease, because he was starting to observe men dropping dead. And really only around 1948 did we start defining heart disease as one of the official causes of death. So he, again, there's no ethics. He can just take human guinea pigs, feed them loads of cholesterol, which means feeding them loads of animal foods, because that's the only place you find cholesterol. And to cut all his experiments short, he concluded there is no relationship between dietary cholesterol and blood cholesterol. We've known that all along. That was his basic conclusion. There's just no relationship. Now, what people don't realize is he exonerated dietary cholesterol. He also exonerated animal foods at the same time, because to feed them dietary cholesterol, he had to feed them animal foods. And people don't make that connection. They don't even really know that animal foods and dietary cholesterol were exonerated as far back as the 1950s. So they just sort of seem to skip those experiments, or they're a bit inconvenient. We'll just carry on with this idea that dietary cholesterol causes blood cholesterol, which it doesn't. Oh, and then maybe if dietary cholesterol doesn't, then it must be fat that does, and it must be particularly animal fat that does. And again, that's all been exonerated. There is no evidence for that whatsoever. Even the guy who ended up telling everyone to follow the Mediterranean diet, which was Ancel Keys, never believed that there was a problem with animal foods, but he hadn't actually spelled it out quite that clearly. So we just still have this idea. So I do not know physiologically how fat can raise dietary cholesterol or cause heart disease. I just don't know. So if you look at things like total cholesterol, VLDL, IDL, LDL, HDL, all the cholesterol in all the different lipoproteins, I don't know. Nobody has shown me the mechanism yet by which eating fat can have an impact on any of those. Now, I do know how eating some plant foods that contain fat, because fat is basically in virtually every food, I do know how that can lower cholesterol. So quick 101 on plant sterols. Plant foods, particularly things like, I don't know, nuts, vegetable oils, most plant foods, oats, grains, whatever, contain substances called plant sterols. Think of those as kind of like plant cholesterol. So when we consume those, the plant cholesterol competes with our human cholesterol and replaces it to an extent, particularly competing in the gut. So let's say you change your diet and you start having loads of vegetable oil, loads of foods containing plant sterols, loads of oats, loads of Benecol, loads of that hideous margarine and all that kind of thing. Your total cholesterol will fall because you have replaced it to an extent with plant cholesterol. Now, if your body wanted plant cholesterol, it would make plant cholesterol. That's kind of my, naive hypothesis, how I think the world probably works. But you've replaced it to an extent. So I can understand how some foods, plant foods that also contain fat, lower cholesterol, but I have no idea how fat can raise cholesterol. Does that make sense? So people say, oh, well, you swapped out butter, which is quite rich in saturated fat. It's not entirely saturated fat, but it's quite rich in saturated fat. You did what we told you. You swapped out your butter. You put instead your Benecol margarine and your total cholesterol fell, and that shows us that total butter raises your total cholesterol. No, it doesn't. It tells you nothing whatsoever about butter. It tells you that when you replace butter with something that contains plant sterols, your cholesterol will fall, but don't blame the butter. There's actually a great study that was done. It's on my website. If you put in butter, coconut oil in the search box, it will bring back one study where they did a randomized control trial, fed people butter, fed people coconut oil, fed people olive oil, and saw exactly what happens. And if you try to raise saturated fat, it makes no difference to cholesterol whatsoever. It's not the saturated fat, it's the plant foods that contain plant sterols.
Amazing. And our last question, and it's all interlinked actually, kind of feel that we've touched on it. I avoid fat because I don't want clogged arteries.
Oh, where do you start? I mean, I say that I like making people laugh when I do presentations because I'm usually at conferences that last about 3 or 4 days and they're in a dark room to make the videos really good. And people are all jet lagged and they're all falling asleep. So I feel sort of I have to entertain them. So I usually say at this point, now, can I just check? Nobody in the audience is actually injecting their food into their arteries. Can I just check you are actually eating your food? Okay, so long as you're eating your food, I have absolutely no idea how your food can leap out of the digestive system and make it into the way of the arterial system and somehow clog up your arteries. It is physiologically impossible. You know, you eat food, it goes down your esophagus, it goes into the stomach, it then goes down into your intestines, the lower intestine and your sort of longer intestine, and then it gets, the nutrients get stripped out as it goes down, and say the fat soluble nutrients or whatever will end up going out on chylomicrons, these fantastic little taxis that will travel around the bloodstream. You do not have fat in your bloodstream. You have taxis carrying fat in your bloodstream. If you took, there's my water there. If you took a glass of water and dropped some olive oil in it, it wouldn't mix. I mean, that just tells you straight away. Think of your blood as water and think of the olive oil as lipids. The body is not going to have lipids openly in the bloodstream. It would cause a problem. So your body has this fantastic little system called the lipoprotein system. I think of it as taxis. And it has these little taxis swimming around in the bloodstream. They're water friendly on the outside and fat friendly on the inside. And they contain the fat cargo. They arrive at the cell. Let's say it's an LDL taxi, a low density lipoprotein taxi. And the little cell will open up with this receptor. It will grab the taxi, take it into the cell, strip it of all the fats that are in the taxi, say, thank you very much. That's what I need to repair things in my cell. And then chuck out the discarded stuff, and off the taxi goes, heading back to the liver. So you do not have fat in your arteries, you just don't. And the idea that eating fat is somehow going to get into your arterial system and clog up your arteries is just utterly, utterly bonkers. And if people want to go away and read a really good book, there's a really good book by one of my heroes, Dr. Malcolm Kendrick. It's called The Clot Thickens, What Really Causes Heart Disease, because it's not cholesterol, and it's all about clotting, but it's not cholesterol that's causing the clotting. You will get some damage in some way to the arterial wall. What can cause damage? About 200 things: smoking, stress, which is a big feature of your podcast, sugar, pollutants, all kinds of things can cause arterial damage. And then you're back to those Russian pathologists. The cargo will be going to the areas of damage to try to repair the damage. But if you keep smoking, if you keep being stressed, if you keep having a bad diet, if you keep having lack of sleep, too much sugar, you'll keep damaging the arterial wall. And then when you get damage on top of damage on top of damage, you either get the narrowing of the artery, which is what can cause the blockage, heart attack, or you get one of the bits of damage breaking away in a sort of calcified plaque bit, and that can cause a blockage further down the system. So it's damage to the arterial system that is going to build and eventually clog the artery. But it really isn't cholesterol or dietary fat that is clogging that up. In fact, those are the substances that are going to do the biggest repair work in the body. So please eat your fat, don't eat your sugar, don't be stressed, get some sleep, get some exercise, don't smoke, and do all the good things that I know you talk about on this great podcast.
Amazing. So what a great way to end. I was going to say final words, but that was just brilliant. A great summary. Thank you so much for your time today, Zoe. Where can people find you and gain more sort of knowledge?
Yeah, pleasure. So I'm on zoeharcombe.com is my main website, and I've been dissecting academic articles for, we're up to almost number 750 now, and I do one every Monday, so that's sort of 15 years or so. On X, I'm at Zoe Harcombe, bit random, a little bit less on nutrition sometimes at the moment, and more on some of the things going on in the world, because some of them are a bit bonkers, and, heat waves, and a heat wave is not 26 degrees, dear Brits, and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, that's who I am. That's where I'm found. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to Six Hats, where it's all about progress, not perfection. If this episode spoke to you, don't wait, hit follow now, leave a quick review, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Want to take your next step today? Download my ebook. The link is waiting in the show notes. And remember, this is general advice only. Always speak to your practitioner for anything medical. See you next time.